Right. Nice. Okay. Yeah, so I guess we can get going now that we are a couple of minutes into the time. So yeah, so welcome everyone, and it's great. It's a pleasure to introduce Emily Wall. She is an assistant professor at Emory University, and she is officially still a postdoc at Northwestern, and she completed her PhD at Georgia Tech. And she has interesting work at the intersection of data visualization, biases, cognitive science. And yeah, so it's great to hear her talk. And so without further ado, Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, let me just share my screen again. Just want to double check you can see my screen and it's not the presenter view.
No, this is correct. Yeah. And also, would you how would you like to have questions during the talk? Usually we just ask in the middle. Is that fine?
Yeah, absolutely. If there are questions and you want to interrupt, just unmute yourself and that we can pause and clarify. That'll work. Cool. Let me move some of the Zoom controls out of the way. Okay, yeah. So thanks again for allowing me to be here. I'm looking forward to talking with you all about some of the work that I've done. That's some of the more human-centric aspects about data science, and in particular, some of the biases that might emerge during data analysis and decision-making. So as Aditya mentioned, I'm a postdoc right now at Northwestern, and then joining Emory University in the computer science department as faculty in a couple months. So here we go. The title of my talk began with "As We Are," and that's a reference to this quote by author Anais Nin that says, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." And so that's to say that our perception of the world isn't purely objective. So people are biased in all sorts of ways that impact the way that we see the world and the way that we operate within it. And sometimes those biases can carry some pretty heavy consequences. So one example that I often give was the Madrid train bombings that happened back in 2004. So the wrong man was charged and imprisoned due to fingerprint analysts who were subject to confirmation bias. So there was a partial fingerprint that had narrowed down the search to a few dozen suspects. And among those suspects was Brandon Mayfield, who was an American man. And he was a lawyer who had recently represented a man with ties to a terrorist organization. And he had also recently himself converted to Islam. And so the FBI ultimately arrested and began to build a case against an innocent man. So if we have the power to prevent errors like these, then we can have a really big impact. So the question then, of course, is what does all of this have to do with visual analytics and with data science? So in visual analytics, we advocate for this combination of humans and machines, where we think we really get the best of both worlds. So computers give us fast and accurate information processing, and humans give us the sense-making capabilities and, of course, domain expertise. And helping people make these kinds of data-driven decisions can be really vital in a lot of domains. So for example, choosing a healthcare provider or a treatment plan based on data from clinical trials, or choosing consumer products that you trust, like which food brands that you're going to buy for your family, or deciding which car to buy based on reliability ratings, helping policymakers understand public opinion and how new policies might affect different regions or populations, helping people understand and prevent security risks, and the list goes on. So business analytics, environmental impact, etc. And the point is that when situations are critical, we ultimately rely on people to make those decisions. So the visualization community has addressed these types of questions for years by building systems that look something like these, where we combine analytics and computations with this power of human perception. But what we haven't really begun to consider until recently is what limitations humans might be bringing into that process, like confirmation bias that I mentioned earlier. So another big one that's important to consider in data science comes from the series of assumptions and decisions that we make in the data analysis process about the nature of the data, about the particular approach to model and interpret that data, and so on. And Andrew Gelman referred to this as a garden of forking paths. So all of these decision points throughout our analysis process will influence our findings. And these decisions may be driven by biases that lead us to analyze the data in a way that allows us to find something interesting, or to interpret the results in a way that favors a hypothesis that we might have already had. And so there are obviously some very important human factors that are driving data science. And some data visualization researchers have begun to consider how to design and support this process, and to help people navigate this the so-called garden of forking paths. And in my research, the key to understanding some of those human limitations is enabled by the fact that people are using these visualization systems more and more to analyze their data and make decisions. And the interactions that they perform in particular in these digital and visual environments are a form of data that we can use to make inferences about the person who's performing those interactions. So there's an abundance of work making inference about a person based on their interactions. So some work has leveraged user interactions to steer analytical models, for example, dragging points around that represent different documents to control a distance function about document similarity, or using user interactions to predict whether people are going to be successful in a visual search task like Where's Waldo, and even looking at the sequence of pan and zoom interactions as they perform this task to infer their personality traits. There's also been some work to recover people's reasoning processes by analyzing their interactions. And my research focuses on a slightly different application of this interaction research, and that is making inferences about a person's biases. So these interactions are not a perfect record of a person's cognition, but they do give us a trace or a rough approximation of someone's reasoning processes and the biases that are influencing that process. So the ultimate vision of my research is to understand how these visual analytics systems can intervene in the analysis process in real time and help people make better decisions. So to give you an example of what that might look like, it's common now for people to submit job applications online. So we can imagine that maybe there's a hiring manager who's analyzing the candidates who've applied for a job with a visualization system that looks something like this. So maybe there's an interactive scatter plot, maybe a table of information down below, and some filter controls off to the side. And maybe without realizing it, this hiring manager has focused mostly on male candidates. So we could envision that an intelligence system could detect implicit gender bias based on the manager's interactions or lack thereof with particular data points, and pop up a recommendation that they go look at similarly qualified female candidates. So if systems can intelligently detect when bias might be present, then we can design systems that can shed some light on that bias and help people make better decisions. So to reach that goal, here's a quick overview of what the rest of my talk is going to look like. So there are three high-level phases that I'll go through. So currently, the systems support users interacting to explore their data. But as I mentioned earlier, that process is impacted by people's biases. But bias is also a very overloaded term. So we use bias in many different contexts to refer to different concepts. So the first phase of the research that I'm going to talk about is giving some context to that terminology in visual analytics. And once I've given some context for that terminology, then I'll describe how we can analyze the way that users are interacting with the data to compute an approximation of bias in the user's analysis process. And then use that knowledge about how there may be bias in the user's analysis process to develop these mitigation strategies that might guide users back to a less biased analysis process by altering the visualization interface in some way. So by creating these system interventions that can bring some real-time awareness about bias to users, we can hopefully help them make better decisions in the end. So starting with phase one about defining bias, this is again addressing the question, how do we define human bias in the context of visual analytics? So again, this is motivated by the use of the term bias to mean many different things in different contexts. But the caveat here is that I'm referring to human bias in particular, as opposed to other sources like algorithmic bias. So we examine the literature on bias in cognitive science.
So sorry.
Sure.
So can I ask a question? So what's the difference between human bias and algorithmic bias?
So when I talk about human bias, I'm talking about some of the examples I have here. We're talking about cognitive biases like confirmation bias, perceptual biases or illusions in the way that we see data. It could also include sort of stereotypes or discriminatory practices. And sometimes those are propagated by machine learning algorithms, but we're referring to the sources that are inherently human.
But aren't those largely the sort of things that percolate into algorithms of machine learning?
Yes, absolutely. But there are also, I mean, inherent in algorithmic biases are also some assumptions that are not at all related to the human. For instance, when you have a decision tree that favors certain certain weights within the tree over others, or particular choice of algorithm may have some implications that are related to that specific choice of algorithm to solve the problem, and not at all related to the human necessarily. It absolutely propagates many human biases, but I just want to delineate, I'm not talking about those types of bias in particular, but the sources that originate from humans.
Oh, great. So, sure, and those can manifest in algorithms and learning and stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, we examine the literature on bias in cognitive science and in visual analytics, and then categorize the way that this term bias gets used, and try to think about how they're relevant in visual analytics. So we distilled this down to 4 potentially overlapping perspectives. So the first is bias is a cognitive processing error. So I alluded to an example of this earlier with confirmation bias. So this is aligned with that classic cognitive science definition of bias, where we think of it as an unconscious error that results from the way that we use heuristics to make quick decisions. And so in cognitive science, there have been hundreds of types of these heuristics and biases that have been cataloged and studied. So if I zoom into just one part of this, there are dozens of errors that result from the way that people may be processing too much information. So this includes things like confirmation bias that I mentioned earlier, another common one, anchoring bias, which I'll get into a little bit more later on. And so when people use these visual analytic systems, these types of biases can impact the decisions that people are making in the way that they interact with the data. And so the next perspective is bias as a filter for information. So this perspective is really about perception. So when there's overwhelming information, bias determines how sensory information is prioritized and interpreted. And so everyone does not necessarily experience the same objective version of reality. So I have an example next that many of you may be familiar with already, about an experiment for a bias called selective perception, where people only perceive a subset of a scene. So researchers asked participants to count the number of times that a basketball was passed between players in white shirts. And participants in this study usually do a pretty good job, and they get the correct number of passes. But due to a phenomenon called inattentional blindness, about half of the participants don't notice that there's a person in a gorilla suit that walks across the middle of the court partway through the video. And so in visualization, perception has been a really big focus for a while, going back at least to Gestalt psychology, which is describing the ways that we perceive patterns among visual elements. So for example, in the top middle, we perceive objects that have the same visual properties to be similar. And we use these principles in visualization design to understand how to best leverage human perception. So next is bias as a preconception. So we're shaped by our culture, our beliefs, our individual experiences, and by everything that's around us. And so this perspective on bias includes all of the preconceived notions and prejudices and stereotypes that we carry around with us. So that can include things like gender bias or racial bias, which may be implicit or explicit. And this type of bias has been studied a lot in the social sciences, but it's the least formally studied perspective within the Viz community in particular. And last is bias as a model mechanism. So bias often has a really negative connotation. So we think of it as a bad thing that needs to be eradicated. But from this perspective, it's really just an objective measure. So in cognitive modeling, we use the term bias to describe where a decision boundary falls. So if you ask people to make a choice between A and B, how often do you choose A over B? And you can quantify that decision boundary with a term called bias. And so in visual analytics, a few papers have taken this approach recently to create these models that quantify something about the user's analysis process. And that one on the left is one of my papers, which I'm going to describe a little bit more next. So those 4 perspectives were originally at a workshop at Viz a few years ago. And it's also been published as a book chapter in a book called Cognitive Biases in Visualization. And so in my own work, since we published those 4 perspectives, I've applied a lot of these different perspectives in different contexts. And so I'll go through some of those in the next slides. So the takeaway message from that phase of the research is now we've defined some context around this psychological construct of bias in visual analytics. And so going forward, we can use this to just organize and contextualize which type we're talking about. So we can avoid some of this confusion about the multiplicity of definitions of bias, which ones we're referring to and which ones we're not in our work going forward. So in the next phase of the research, I'm focusing on the question, can visual analytics systems characterize human bias in real time during the analysis process? And the emphasis here is on real time. So in cognitive science, bias can be captured and quantified, but usually only after people have made a series of decisions in these really controlled laboratory experiments. And so here I want to focus on characterizing bias during the analysis process and before a potentially bad decision is made. So I'll describe a little bit of the theory in developing those metrics and then describe how we evaluated them briefly. So tying this back to that first phase of the research, here I'm adopting the perspective of bias as a model mechanism. And so what I mean by that is that we want to derive a set of metrics to objectively quantify or model something about the user's analysis process without necessarily implying anything about that bias being good or bad just yet. And so we developed a set of 6 computational metrics that can be applied to user interaction sequences to characterize bias in the analysis process. But instead of digging into the math, because nobody wants to do that on Friday afternoon, I'll go through a more intuitive description of those metrics and make it a bit more digestible. So each of those metrics is represented as a number between 0 and 1. So 0 means there's no bias, and 1 means that there's high bias. And if we look at those metrics over time, we can get a sense of when the user is exhibiting high bias in their analysis process and when they might be mitigating or correcting or deviating. And we rely on comparing the interactions that we observe from the user to some notion of unbiased behavior using a Markov model. So the Markov model allows us to predict with some probability what the next interaction is going to be that the user will perform given their current interaction. So in this example, there are 2 states, E and A, and each arrow represents a transition between those states. And those transitions all have probabilities associated with them. So the sequence of states that you might enter forms a chain. And in the case of my research, those states are made up of tuples of the type of interaction that the user is performing. So that could be clicks or hovers or drags, and the data point that the user interacted with. So to give you a concrete example, Here's a scatter plot with 15 data points. And let's say that there are hover and click interactions in this visualization. So in this case, the state space has 30 possible states for each combination of those 15 data points with the two interaction types, click and hover. Excuse me. So we use this model to understand how likely a particular sequence of interactions is. And we compare that those observed interactions to some expected behavior with a variety of statistical tests depending on the type of data that we're looking at. So for example, the data point coverage metric is a ratio of the number of unique interactions, the number of unique data points that the user interacts with compared to the total observed number of interactions that they perform. So to give you an example of what that metric might look like, let's say again that you have this scatter plot of job candidates, and maybe this hiring manager is really interested in a candidate that's represented by the point A up in the top left. So maybe they keep returning to the same person in their data exploration. So I'm going to animate this in a second. I'll keep track of the total number of interactions that the hiring manager performs on the right-hand side, and also the total number of unique interactions. And so those two numbers in combination are going to be used to compute that metric value between 0 and 1, which I'll show up above that. So now I'll animate it. So the bias value spikes in the beginning when the hiring manager first returns to that data point of interest A, and then it kind of fluctuates and goes down when they start to look at new candidates again, and then goes back up as they return to that same candidate again, A. So you can see the sort of fluctuations based on when they return to that same person of interest. So another example is the attribute distribution metric. So this one compares the distribution of users' interactions with the data to the real underlying distribution in the data set for some attribute. So let's say again that there's a job ad that's requesting candidates who have 3 to 5 years of experience on the job. And so maybe you get an application pool that reflects that distribution. So you have a peak that's around 3 to 5 years. And then the hiring manager is exploring the data and interacts with the applicants like this orange line. So these are really similar distributions. So in this case, that attribute distribution bias value is going to be really low. But maybe they start to focus more on candidates who have slightly more experience and that curve shifts, or maybe it shifts even more. And so ultimately, this metric is quantifying what's the biggest difference between those two curves. So in this case, the bias value is going to be much higher. But remember, in this case, we're still just quantifying how the user's interactions deviate from that underlying distribution of the data. We're not necessarily implying anything about high bias being a bad thing in this case. So there's context, right? The hiring manager may have just realized that they needed someone with more experience, and so they focused their analysis accordingly. And there's nothing inherently wrong about that. So I've given just a couple of examples, but these metrics are really designed to be part of a more extensible theory. So these concepts of coverage and distribution could be applied to other things as well. So for example, how much time or how many interactions do you perform across different views in a visualization that has multiple coordinated views? So you can quantify how the user is spreading their attention, covering or distributing their attention across those views with similar metrics. So now we need to make sure that those bias metrics work. So we conducted a formative study to figure out how to use these metrics in practice and to make sure that they can tell us something that's useful about a user's interactions. So again, referring back to that first phase, we took the metrics that are formulated from this perspective of bias as a model mechanism, and we wanted to see if we could use that model to identify cognitive processing errors. And specifically, we'll look at anchoring bias. So anchoring bias is the tendency to anchor or rely too heavily on some initial information that's presented to the user. So we ran a small study with 10 participants using a visual analytic tool to look at data about basketball players. And we asked them to categorize the players based on the position that they play, and we gave them some anchoring information depending on which condition they were in. So I'm going to skip the details of this study for the sake of time and to get to some other interesting findings later on. But if you have questions about the validation of those metrics, I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A afterward if there's time, or offline. So collectively, the takeaway from this phase of the work is that now we have this set of computational metrics that we can use to characterize bias just based on the way that the user is interacting with the data and the visualization. And so in phase 3, now we want to address the question, can these metrics be used in a visual analytics system to mitigate human biases? So referring back again to that first phase of the research, we're again taking these metrics that are formulated from the model mechanism perspective. But this time we want to see if there's a relationship to preconception biases. And so specifically, we'll look at implicit biases. So implicit bias describes how our judgments can be unconsciously impacted by attitudes and stereotypes about the world. So this can include our beliefs about gender, sexuality, race, and so on. And so I do want to clarify that this is not the same thing as overt discrimination, though. So implicit bias is not intentional, nor is it conscious. So despite our best intentions, thinking really hard about it doesn't necessarily fix the problem. So the goal for me in this part of the research is to just increase awareness about what these implicit biases might be, and take them from this unconscious level into something that's consciously on people's mind as they're making decisions. So to study these implicit preconception biases, we chose a recent politically relevant scenario in Georgia. So we asked people to choose a committee of 10 politicians that would be responsible for reviewing public opinion on the recent bill that was banning abortion in Georgia after 6 weeks. And so we expected to observe a number of biases here. For example, gender bias, bias toward one's own political party affiliation, bias toward specific age groups, and so on. And so again, the goal here was to increase awareness about some of these potentially implicit biases that may be influencing the way that people make decisions by showing them some history of their prior interactions, which we're referring to as interaction traces. And that the hope is that that visual history might make users aware of these implicit biases. So we developed a visualization system to test this and showed that history in a few ways. So the system that we developed has an interactive scatter plot as that primary view. And when you hover on a point in the scatter plot, details for that point, or in this case, details about that politician, are shown down below. And you can apply filters to view different subsets of the data on the left-hand side. And then the politicians that you select for your committee are shown on the bottom right. And so we show these interaction traces or interaction history in a few ways. So there is, there we go. I was waiting for that interaction to happen. If we zoom into this view that's on the top right, we use two different colors here. We use gray to represent the underlying distribution of the data, and blue to represent the way that the user's attention has been distributed, or the way that their interactions have been distributed across the data. And so this view is going to compare those two things. And as the user is interacting, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I have a very, very quick question. So what's the view that the user sees? Like, do they see just the names of the people? Do they also see like some of the other attributes that you showed?
Yeah, so the data looks like this. So there's a number of attributes about, I realize you can't see my pointer here, but if you look in the bottom, let's see, I can highlight that view at least. Oops. Yeah, this bottom center view, I guess, to avoid messing this up more. So we have attributes about the politicians, like their gender, their political party affiliation, their occupation, And then on the right-hand side of that, we have some policy views. So whether they're in favor of or against particular political policies. And so all of the names for these politicians were artificially generated based on U.S. Census data. So they're not real politicians in this case. They're fictitious. Yeah, so we have these two colors, gray for the underlying data set, blue for the way that the user is interacting with the data. And so those bars will, the blue bars will update in real time as the user is hovering or clicking on those politicians. So if we look at just one attribute at the top, political party, in this case, the gray bars show that the data set has slightly more Republicans than Democrats. So Republicans are the bar on the right that's a little bit taller. But the user's interactions so far in blue are skewed heavily toward Democrats. So the blue bar is much higher on the left for Democrats than it is on the right for Republicans. So we can also look at what this looks like for numerical attributes. So we can take age, for example. And now the gray curve shows that the data peaks around about 58 years old. But the user's interactions in blue are skewed heavily to focus on older politicians, primarily between 60 and 75 years old. And so the coloring, this orange coloring up at the top, is based on that attribute distribution bias metric value that I showed earlier. So the more the user's interactions deviate from that underlying data, the stronger that color is going to be. And so we also show interaction traces in the scatter plot as well. So as the user clicks or hovers on the circles in the scatter plot, the colors of those points are changing. So the unfilled circles are the politicians who haven't been interacted with at all. And the darker the shade of blue, the more the user has interacted with that particular politician. So what I just showed you were real-time interaction traces.
So can I ask you so a quick question about this? So it's really cool, this kind of way you can interact with that. I was wondering if you thought about, like, if you're trying to hit all these attributes and kind of match a population with a fairly small sample. So it's so I think it could very well be that you aren't able to match on all the attributes. So have you thought about that? Like, one you can try is like pick some some random choices and see on random what the max kind of deviation is, and that might be large on average.
Yeah, that's entirely likely. So I think we kind of observed a little bit of this. I'll talk about some studies that we ran with this next, but we ran this with a few different versions of the data, and some of the data that we ran this on were higher dimensional. So we had all of the attributes that I showed, where it's like their political party and age and a bunch of different policy views and their religion and their occupation and so on. And we ran it with other variations that had much lower dimensionality. So only a few things that we thought users would care about more. And so what we observed is that people are able to maintain a much better awareness and intentionality about the dimensions when it's lower, which is to be expected, right? As the dimensionality is high, cognitive load is going to become an issue, right? And so people have to make some choices explicitly about which things they're going to care about and focus on, and which ones they don't.
Yeah, cool. There might also be some some statistical or high dimensional geometry reasons why you can't satisfy these in high dimensions, which is I guess you're looking at from the cognitive perspective, but
yeah, absolutely. So I think if in the most ideal world, if you interact with every data point a precisely equal number of times, you will satisfy, you will have no bias across any of them. That's true. But the goal here isn't necessarily for the user to try to interact in a particular way to meet that expectation or to optimize for that. Our goal is really much more about awareness, right? So can I just draw the user's attention to the things that they may not be aware they're focusing on. So yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the example that I just showed, these are real-time interaction traces. So they update in the interface while the user is performing their task. We also showed these interaction traces in a summative format after they had selected their committee of politicians. And so these looked really similar to those other distributions that I showed you that compares the user's interactions to the underlying data, except that it happened after they had already selected their committee of politicians. But they did have an opportunity to revise their committee after the fact, after they viewed this if they wanted to. We also tested a variation of the interface where we showed interaction traces both in real time and again in a summative format afterward. And we compared these alternatives against a baseline control condition. So our experiment compared these 4 different interface variations. And so the goal here was for testing these interventions was to understand how these interaction traces can impact user behavior, the decisions that people ultimately make, and importantly, their awareness about those potential unconscious biases. So we ran a series of experiments. There were 3 formative in-lab experiments and a 4th crowdsourced experiment. So we used the political domain that I already mentioned, and we also replicated this for another task about movies just to demonstrate the generalizability of the technique. Excuse me. So I'm going to focus on the results from the crowdsourced experiment for the talk though. So we recruited 56 participants from Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we restricted it to people who were located in Georgia because of the political context of the task. So we rejected 6 of those participants due to data quality issues, and the remainder completed the study. So we had somewhere between 11 and 14 participants in each of those 4 conditions. So first, I'll talk about some results related to behavior. So to measure that, we used the metrics again that I introduced earlier. And in particular, we focused on the attribute distribution metric. So we measure how the user's interactive behaviors align with the distribution of the data. And so each of these charts shows the values, the bias values for different attributes of the data. So on the x-axis, we have the metric value. So it's increasing as you go to the right. So higher numbers are a bigger deviation in the user's behavior compared to the data set. And we can focus on just the political scenario up at the top first. So, and the top row in particular shows that the control participants actually had lower bias metric values. So in other words, they had consistently lower deviation in behavior from the baseline compared to the participants in the other conditions. And to a slightly lesser extent, this also appears to be true in the movies task as well, where the control participants actually had better alignment of their interactions compared to the underlying distribution of the data. And so this isn't really what we expected at all, right? Like we thought showing these interaction traces, people would try to match those distributions, but that's just not what we observed. So we found the opposite to be true. And we suspect that this may be related to conscious versus unconscious biases. So maybe seeing these interaction traces may have reminded or reaffirmed some really explicit or conscious decision-making criteria that further biased the analysis process and made them, focus more on choosing female politicians, for example, or choosing Democratic or Republican politicians that might align with their own views. So we also looked at the composition of the committees that people chose with respect to their political party affiliation and gender as a way to understand the impact of those interaction traces on people's decisions. So we have phase 1 on the x-axis, and after people had the opportunity to revise their committee, that's phase 2, and that's shown on the y-axis. So everything that falls on that diagonal line means that the person did not alter the composition of their committee between those phases. So most people really don't make many changes. And we used triangles to represent the control participants, and then circles to represent people who saw some form of interaction traces, whether in a summative or real-time format or both. And if we just focus on shape, we really don't see any significant patterns between conditions here. This was kind of expected. So we anticipated that we might be more likely to influence people's behavior or to influence their awareness about bias, but we figured it would be a lot less likely to actually change the decisions that people are making based on these interventions. But we do see some patterns if we focus just on color. So in the chart on the left, this is showing the ratio of committee members that people chose as Democrats on the X and the Y axes. So in the top right, for example, would be committees that were made up entirely of Democrats, and in the bottom left would be committees entirely composed of Republicans. And then we colored these points by the political party affiliation of the participant. So we see this cluster of blue points up in the top right. So those are participants who identified as Democrats. And by no surprise, they chose committees that were predominantly Democratic politicians. And we also see a similar red cluster down in the bottom left, representing study participants who identified as Republicans and also chose predominantly Republican politicians in their committee. And the qualitative feedback that we got from participants really echoed this too. So one participant said that I chose based on who I thought might share my values. And that sentiment was common among many participants. So interestingly, in the chart on the right, we don't see any consistent trends about the gender of participants. So in this chart, we're looking at the ratio of males in the committees that people chose on the X and the Y axes. So again, top right is a committee made up of entirely male politicians, and the bottom left is committees of entirely female politicians. And it's colored by the gender of the participant, so blue for male and red for female. So we see a few clusters. In the bottom left, we see a red cluster of female participants who chose committees made up entirely of women. And we see another cluster of blue down there where it's men who chose committees predominantly made up of women. But again, no significant trend really emerged here. And again, the explanations that people provided often reflected these really conscious choices or biases for the most part. So one participant indicated, I wanted most politicians to be women. I truly feel abortion is an issue only women can really comment on. And so this participant ultimately chose a committee made up of 10 women. So the takeaway message here is that the condition that participants were in, so in which format they saw interaction traces, did not really influence their decisions, but there was some relationship between the participants' political party affiliation and the committees that they chose. And this was more or less in line with our predictions. So we also gauged awareness about unconscious biases with two questions. So first, are you surprised by the distribution of your attention that's shown by the interaction traces? And participants could answer that with yes or no. And second, to what degree were you focused on that attribute? Which participants would answer with high, medium, low, or a fourth option I didn't show here is not applicable if they were not focused on that attribute at all. So we thought it would be likely that participants who expressed surprise might represent implicit biases. So they see some way that they've distributed their attention across different attributes, and it's surprising to them. Perhaps that was something that was unconscious to their decision-making process. And those which they did not express surprise about were probably something that they explicitly focused on. So similar to our previous findings about behavior, we find a significant effect here for political party. So people who said that they were not surprised by their interaction traces actually had higher bias for political party. So again, we think that this relates to this like conscious versus unconscious biases. So the conscious biases are really overpowering the behavioral signals that we can pick up in the interface compared to the implicit ones. So we also found that the attributes that people had high focus on would lead to higher bias, again, because of their conscious biases. So when somebody explicitly focused on an attribute, so for example, trying to choose politicians who agree with their own political party and the politics task, they may exhibit more bias in their behaviors. And we see the same thing again in the movies task. So the things that people focus on tended to have a higher bias. And we also believed that interaction traces would make participants generally more aware of some of these unconscious biases. So we show high, medium, and low focus. So which attributes they were focused on a lot and which ones they were not focused on so much on the x-axis. And then how many of the study participants indicated that level of focus counted up on the y-axis. And those 4 charts are representing the 4 different conditions in the study. So we color-coded based on whether participants expressed surprise or not. So in this first chart for control, we see taller red bars and shorter blue bars compared to all of the other charts. So what this means is that participants were generally more often surprised by the way that their interactions were distributed across the data compared to other conditions. So this was consistent with our prediction that the interaction traces would increase people's awareness about their analytic focus and their decision-making criteria. So they were ultimately less surprised overall based on the way that they distributed their attention when they had these interaction traces. We also had some qualitative evidence about awareness from the interaction traces. So one participant indicated that they had blindly chosen initially using the interaction traces and then shifted their focus in their revision phase. So they said, my revised committee was solely focused on trying to get vast ideological perspective without necessarily focusing on men or women. And then I did more of a blind choosing without focusing so much on gender the second time around, referring to when they had the opportunity to make that revision. So they gained some awareness from that view and adjusted their strategy in the next phase. So the takeaway message here is that the interaction traces generally increase people's awareness about these potential implicit biases. And I forgot to mention, we also found between those 4 conditions, people preferred real-time or summative interaction traces. But when we showed both of them, real-time and summative, they actually viewed everything as significantly less useful overall. Again, probably related to that like high cognitive load, just too many things to manage. And so they perceived all of it to be less useful. So this study is currently under review, but importantly, this also made us realize a few key directions for future work. So in particular, it made us question what does it mean to make balanced or unbiased choices? So the results of this study can have some serious implications if we think that we might be able to influence people's behaviors. So for example, when do we want people to choose proportionally versus equally? So if we have a sample of 10 people from a population of 20, then if the population is 50% men and 50% women, then choosing a proportional sample is 5 men and 5 women. And then likewise, choosing an equal sample is also 5 men and 5 women. But what if the initial population isn't 50-50? So maybe instead it's 70% men and 30% women. Then choosing a proportional sample is choosing 7 men and 3 women. And an equal sample would be, again, still choosing 5 men and 5 women, in spite of that sort of mismatched proportion to the underlying data. And so if visualizations might have some influence on user behavior and nudge people to interact in a particular way, then we really need to really deeply consider when each of these perspectives is the appropriate one to use. So whatever baseline we're comparing the user's behavior against needs to be adjusted accordingly. So we really have to engage with these questions about what's the ideal user behavior in a given scenario. So when we're designing metrics to detect bias or designing interfaces to support decision-making, we really need to think carefully about how we might be influencing people's behavior and decision-making. And this obviously has some really heavy moral and ethical implications as designers to make sure that we're not unfairly pushing people in a particular direction. So to start to think about and address that concern, we further built out that system that we used in the previous study to facilitate data exploration while increasing people's awareness of those biases with a number of different interaction trace features. So I won't go into details about the system, but I do want to mention one key feature that we added, which is the feature that allows you to set a target distribution. So like that example that I just showed, where we may want to be proportional, or we may want to be equal, or we may want to have something entirely different. So in this leftmost column, the heights of these black lines represent the underlying distribution of the data. So the user's interactions in blue are compared against that distribution. And in the middle column, the black lines are all at the same height. So this is representing a target distribution that's equal across all categories of the data. And in the rightmost column, we see an entirely different set of heights for those black bars. This is a custom user-defined target. So for example, if I am on an admissions committee, I may set target distributions that are entirely different from the underlying data set and not equal, but based on the nature of our specific diversity goals in the department. So this system, along with some details about a usability study, is also currently under review. And so in addition to that interaction trace strategy that I just showed you, we also more broadly consider the design space of ways that a visualization might be manipulated to support better decision-making and mitigate biases. And I realize we only have a few minutes left, so I'll again just defer the details of that. If you have some questions, feel free to ask. And just to quickly wrap up about that phase of the research. So I've shown a design space of ways that we could make some manipulations to visualization, and showed one instantiation of that and how that influenced people's behavior and increased their awareness about bias. So stepping back up to just quickly summarize the work that I discussed on bias, the goal is to really improve decision-making processes by quantifying when people might be subject to biases, and then figuring out how we can design interfaces that will help nudge people toward a more reflective decision-making process. So that involves a lot about making some implicit aspects of the user's focus become more explicit and making these unconscious biases become more conscious. So going forward, I'm interested to further pursue the way that we use visualization to inform data-driven decision-making as a mode of communication, and particularly in domains like the ones that I discussed that may have some societal impact, like politics or hiring scenarios. So I know we only have a few minutes left, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
I have a question.
Thanks a lot. This was a good talk. So yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. This is a very interesting talk. Maybe this kind of relates partly to Jeff's question earlier. I was just curious about what happens when maybe you don't have a lot of data, like maybe they just don't click on many of the data points. And so you can compare the distributions, but like the sample size is so low that even if they were picking like completely at random in a completely fair way, you know, there would be a big disagreement between the distributions. Do you think it could be useful to have like some kind of confidence score or something associated with like when you get to the point of being able to make those comparisons? Or
that's a great point. So I haven't thought about confidence scores in the past, but I think that's a great idea. The way I have been thinking about it is that if we want to measure bias from the user's interactions, that just has a lot of implications in how we design the system and what interactions we support. So for example, one really small design choice that we didn't really think about until we were trying to measure something was what happens when you hover on a point in a scatter plot, right? You have a detail view that's populated to the side. And oftentimes, if you hover on that point and you move your mouse over to the dead space in the scatter plot, those details are still visible. And so we made one small design choice that we had to make was that those details disappear when you're not hovering explicitly on that point, with the goal being that now we have this additional measure about the duration of that interaction and how long you are likely focusing on the actual details for that point. So it's still very imperfect. It's not capturing everything. You can certainly be looking at the screen and not getting anything out of it, right? Or not interacting in any explicit ways. So there are some design implications that can improve that. And I think, you know, including other things like eye tracking or like other ways of like gauging some passive engagement with the data that's not explicit to those interactions might also help. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff we can try to do to make this, to make it either more accurate or to give people some sense of the uncertainty around it and the confidence around those metrics.
Yeah. So great talk. So so I've been so thinking about this problem of interactive viz and the garden of forking paths, like as soon as I saw that paper, and so this is great. So I like how you've so approached this. So and one thing I had not so thought about was these kind of visual nudges to try and keep them from being unfair, unbiased in some way. So I'm wondering, so what your thoughts are and if these kind of visual nudges are actually so sufficient to prevent biases, or if you need more like hard constraints in place, and what the trade-off is between those two kind of approaches. I mean, I don't know how to do hard constraints in interactive viz, right? But
yeah. So that's a great point. So these interventions were really minimally intrusive, right? Like we showed some additional stuff in the interface and people could choose whether or not to engage with it. And that may have some unconscious influence on their behaviors, which, you know, we saw some differences in how people interacted based on those interaction traces. But that's also a great point, right? We saw at the end of the day, this doesn't actually affect the decisions that people make in any meaningful way. There's still conscious biases that far overpower any sort of unconscious nudges or subtle nudges that we could make. And so there are other things that we could imagine that would be more aggressive, right? That may be worthwhile or maybe not, depending on the context. So you could imagine in the context of this, see if I can pull up this other slide, in the context of this system for, shoot, where'd it go? For hiring, this one. Where the example that I gave earlier, you can imagine if there's some implicit bias where the system thinks that you're being biased toward male candidates, maybe it disables some filters in the interface, right? Maybe that's a bit more aggressive, or maybe you can imagine like maybe some of these examples are silly, but you could imagine also like resizing the points in the scatter plot. So like the male candidates become really tiny dots that are hard to interact with, and the female candidates become more prominent. Like there are some examples that could be a bit more aggressive, or you know, the system could actually just restrict your behavior in certain ways. Of course, those like all have some usability trade-offs too. Like people would probably grouch if you just start disabling certain things in the interface. But I think they're interesting ideas, and it would be definitely worthwhile to test out.
Yeah, cool. Those are even more great insights. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, that's very nice. I had a somewhat similar question about like among the measures that you've shown, did you find that some were more effective at nudging user behavior than others? Or different kinds of feedback? I guess maybe you don't, maybe that was in a different context, but like different kinds of feedback that you give to people. Or did sometimes they just like double down on their biases?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, that's what we more or less observed with respect to like the decisions that people make, and how we saw that people got more biased in their behaviors when they had the interaction traces. Right, like we saw lower bias for the top row control participants than we did for the intervention participants, because probably for exactly that reason. They see some distribution of their interactions, like, oh, damn, I really didn't mean to vote. Like, I didn't mean to interact so much with Republicans. I need to go like double down, and, you know, so I think there's definitely some interplay between those conscious and unconscious biases. And I don't know how to sort that out. It seems complicated.
But I guess in your study, that like the task that they were doing was kind of related to like the political party factor. Would you say? I mean, that like, you know, that they thought that was relevant to the task. I wonder if you would get different results if like the task was not relevant to any of the attributes there.
Yeah, so I think so we expected like that these explicit biases would be really really salient, and people would double down based on political party and various other things, because it's a really emotional topic, right? People get very heated and have strong opinions. So that's one of the reasons we added this additional task about movies. And so we didn't have as strong of results in the movie scenario, but we did still observe similar things. So the chart that I was just showing about people's behaviors and how control participants were less biased, like had less bias in their behavior than the other conditions, we still saw that to a lesser degree, but we did still see that in this bottom row where the label B is for the movies task as well. So it wasn't statistically significant for as many of the attributes, but we did still observe similar behaviors. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that the political scenario definitely has a role, but it's not the only factor, I suppose.
Cool. So anyone else, students? Okay, so if not, yeah, let's thank Emily again. Thanks for doing this, and it was great to see these talks.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure getting to share this.
Yeah, thank you. See you. Nice meeting you too.
Yeah, hope everybody has a good weekend.
Take care.
Yeah.